Welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works, a podcast for teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, and anyone else who supports teachers in the classroom. This show is a proud member of the BE Podcast Network, shows that help you go beyond education. Find all our shows at bepodcastnetwork.com. I am Gene Tavernetti, the host for this podcast, and my goal for this episode, like all episodes, is that you laugh at least once and that you leave with an actionable idea for better teaching. A quick reminder, no cliches, no buzzwords, only stuff that works. A little more than 2 years ago, Dr. Frank Rodriguez brought together a group of colleagues from across the country to discuss an issue he had been encountering in his after-school programs: the impact of screens on children and the behaviors that seem to emerge as a result of excessive screen time. After meeting virtually for several months, the group began gathering in person to more deeply examine the issue, identifying specific challenges schools were facing and exploring what might be done to mitigate some of those behaviors. Over time, the work evolved into developing a systematic approach that schools could use to address what we began to see as runaway technology, where technology was driving the conversation rather than serving as a tool to support learning. Not long after, the idea emerged that a book should be written, one that would do more than simply point out the problem. We wanted to identify the issues clearly and, more importantly, outline practical systems schools could implement to address them. Instead of just saying, "Isn't this terrible?" we wanted to offer solutions that we knew could work. That effort led to the book Digital Captives, Helping Schools Strike a Balance Between Humans and Hardware, written by Frank Rodriguez, Donna Smith, and myself, Gene Tavernetti. Today, we're going to talk about that book, and we're joined by a friend of the podcast and a respected voice in education, Bart Hoffman, who will guide the conversation as we explore what schools can actually do to address this growing challenge and the benefits educators may gain from reading and applying the ideas in this book. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. So very excited to have an old friend, Bart Hoffman, here today to talk to us about our new book, Digital Captives. So Bart, so happy and thankful that you're here to conduct this interview with us.
Thank you. You argue that schools have shifted from producing digital natives to becoming digital captives. What does that shift really mean?
We started this work thinking about how students were changing over the course of, the years following the pandemic. Gene and I are talking and thinking about the start of our work together back in the early part of the century in 2004, I think, 2005. The optimism at that point was about how the technology was going to really transform education and the students were going to grow up in it in a very healthy way. And be digital natives in a way that we were digital immigrants too. What happened in actuality, from our perspective, is that everything shifted so fast. Everything from social media to now AI, but also just the internet and quick cut videos that really shifted how students think and how we do as well, how we interact with each other. And at some point, it tipped the scales to where they went from being natives to really being captives to the screens, whether the screens be at home in the form of phones and tablets and TV, or at school in the form of tablets and Chromebooks.
In addition to that, the work that Frank does in his Rise After School programs, he was able to see these differences manifest. I mean, they were very clear differences. Kids not being able to pay attention as well, executive function were not where typical 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds were. And so it wasn't just something that we had read in a book. I mean, Frank was experiencing it every day with his folks.
Yeah, and if I can piggyback on that, actually, I'm going to say that even more than myself, my staff was experiencing it. And we were experiencing it from like 4-year-olds through 22-year-olds because, we employ a lot of 18, 19, 20, 22-year-olds in our after-school programs, tutoring programs, summer programs, et cetera. And we were seeing that they were acting differently in terms of like communication, how they wrote, but also even things like eye contact or how we conducted interviews, shifting to Zoom, how many would show up in their pajamas on the interviews. So there was definitely a shift there. But we also noticed it in the programs with like 4 and 5-year-olds, like Gene was saying, that were having a difficult time assimilating to what the school structures were like, partly because they missed preschool, but also partly because they were coming in, it seemed to us at the time, wired a little bit differently. So we were having those issues with 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds who were like running out of classrooms in ways we hadn't seen before. But also we had like 7 and 8-year-olds cutting themselves, doing self-harm threats. Kids at, 7th and 8th grade talking about depression in ways that they hadn't. So we know that something shifted. Initially, we attributed it to the pandemic. This is 2022 we're talking about. As we got further from that and we got more into post-pandemic life, we saw that those things weren't subsiding and that there were some other things tied to it as well that were going on, not just academically, but also communication-wise and social-emotionally. So I think that that we saw that something had tipped in the kids. And the pandemic was a huge tipping point. As we got further into the research, we found that it started prior to that.
Could you talk a little bit more about when you realized that technology was moving from augmenting instruction to replacing it?
I mean, we've been working in schools together for going on 22 years. When schools first started bringing technology, I mean, I was a teacher in the 1990s and Gene was a teacher in the 1980s. And we had, like one laptop or one desktop. And you played Oregon Trail on it or whatever. You use it for word processing. In the early 2000s, we started seeing, 3 or 4 or 5 iMacs. And we talk about this in the book, the evolution of that, how those then got replaced by laptops. And then the Chromebook cart came in as broadband expanded. At some point in about 2014, I think that's a hinge point for us in our book and other books about this as well, in the work by Jonathan Haidt and Johan Hari. About 2014, there was some sort of tipping point where all of a sudden all the hardware was in place. And what happened right at that point, if you think back to it historically, and we talk about this, I think in chapter 1, that No Child Left Behind went away at the end of 2015. And what came in to replace it, ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, was a lot more, like personally tailored instruction, less accountability on assessments. Not that, draconian accountability is great either, but once that shift happened through the E-rate, funding happened where funding exploded to where every district could have broadband and be able to have 30 Chromebooks on at the same time in every classroom. Once those things happened, there was like just this surge of programs that came into classrooms. And so I think the tipping point was probably 2016, 2017. We didn't realize that at the time. I think we realized that after the fact that, wait a minute, what's happening here? And so when we shifted in our own programs, we've shifted away from that into like more just interacting with each other type of work because we've seen the shift happen in the school day, in the after school programs, and as a result of COVID. So I think all of those things together really kind of brought it together.
And then I think for me, as I was working with schools during COVID, I mean, basically I thought I was retired on, March 13th, 2000. And when, and the interest from the districts were, okay, can you coach us in how to do this distance learning? How to do this virtual learning? And so the schools got so wrapped up in that. How do we continue to provide services to kids, even though they knew they weren't doing a good job? But because of the things that Frank had talked about, I mean, there were some schools that would just check out the Chromebooks so the kids they were available for lessons, and they did the best they could during that process. But when they came back, the teachers didn't give it up. The teachers, it was almost they were doing the same type of virtual lessons, but in person with the kids. And so they are the ones that weren't giving up the laptops and the Chromebooks when we came back. So even though stuff was happening before the pandemic, that distance learning, that whole way to look at that distance learning really made an impact on moving forward. So that really showed me the captivity part. They were captive at that point.
So in a sense, the pandemic didn't create the problem, it accelerated it. What became normalized that should have remained temporary?
I mean, I think education being transactional, we talk about this as well in the book, how to me, to Bart, to Gene, to you, who are lifelong educators, education is transformational. And at that point, out of necessity, I mean, we understand we were working in schools. We were all working in schools at the time on March 13th. Like like Gene mentioned, it became transactional. We had to have some sense of normalcy for the kiddos. And so we transitioned into the Zoom learning, into, Google Meets learning. Some of that never went away. We walk into classrooms now. I think what differentiates our book from others that are really well written, what differentiates us is that we're actually in classrooms. We were in classrooms together yesterday. We were in 22 classrooms yesterday. I sat and planned lessons with teachers on Monday. Gene tomorrow is going to go back and observe classrooms at a high school. And what we notice is there is such a plethora of material. There are so many companies that are vying for that digital dollar, that it overwhelms teachers' decision making. And I think what's happened is that it's become like almost too much riches. And I think that's what, instead of like really thinking about what am I trying to achieve with this lesson, it's become more like, what of all these offerings that I can have digitally can the kids partake in? And I think that is what should have gone away that didn't go away.
So based on all your observations, what most concerns you post-pandemic?
I think it goes back to things that we were doing 20 years ago. Just, how do we present lessons well? And the way we always talked about instruction is in a well-designed lesson, which includes those transformational elements that Frank was talking about. So the teacher is leading students in conversation, in structured conversation, in lots of checking for understanding, in lots of making sure that the kids are paying attention, which wasn't happening again during the pandemic, and which was just assumed when you had the Chromebook out. Going back to some foundational things that the research that we're looking at, I mean, it started in the 50s, 60s, that nothing's been disputed, but in this ageist society, there is no institutional memory for stuff. Every 15 years, it seems like we're starting brand new. The things that we started out doing when we were working together, talking about using mini whiteboards, to check for understanding. It's like we go back again now and never heard of it. Oh, really? Where did these come from? And so I think, a lot of what we talk about in the book has been foundational since the 80s.
I think, if I can piggyback on that, I think obviously those are all like classroom-based concerns, and 100% I agree with them. I was telling Gene yesterday about a post that I came across recently, and it was a post that I wrote in 2015, and I found it in a closet somewhere. And it said in 2000, and I wrote this in 2015, in 2005, we were working with teachers on using whiteboards to check for understanding. In 2015, we're working with teachers on using whiteboards to check for understanding. And the question is, in 2025, we'll be using whiteboards. And the answer was, yeah, that's what we were working on last year, So it's like Gene's talking about, it's like the stuff just goes away. In the book, we talk about two really well-known metaphors in education. One is Rip Van Winkle, going to sleep and waking up 100 years later, and he wakes up and he recognizes nothing. He looks around, he sees airports and he sees, cars and everything. He's got no idea what anything is until he walks into a school. And then he feels like, oh, I recognize this. This is a school, right? So that's one we talk about. But we also talk about the pendulum. And the pendulum is actually even more well-known in these dramatic swings in practice. Now we're seeing some backlash, I think, and just in the last 3 days, there's been an article in the New York Times about, iPads in kindergarten and parents starting to rebel against that. That was yesterday, the 10th. On Monday, there was an article in Education Next, and it talked about, it was called Logged In, Tuned Out, regarding middle school and high school students. They're on their Chromebooks, they tune out. And we see that in practice when we're in the classrooms like we were yesterday. And there was another article by the gentleman who wrote Digital Delusion, which is kind of not a companion, but a complementary book to ours. And he had some data about how, as schools locked in to more and more digital, the NAEP scores kind of just hit a plateau and then have fallen over the last 10 years. So that's all instructionally. And so what we're seeing now is this pendulum possibly swinging back the other way towards do away with the screens. Well, you can't do that. Kids need to be able to interact with technology in a healthy way. and which was what we talked about, just having balance. But I want to go back to what Gene was talking about in your question about what most scares you. And I'll tell you what most scares me is broader actually than schools. Johan Hari in Still in Focus talks about this. Jonathan Haidt talks about it in Next Generation. But I think to me, the ones that even hit it more on the head are Nicholas Carr, like in Super Bloom, and Timothy Wu in Attention Merchants, and even going back to Neil Postman in the 1980s, about how if adults' attention spans and ability to focus and communicate well and have multiple perspectives, if those are going downhill, then what happens to the next generation? You know, and we talk about that in the book, like a second grader or a third grader who's being acclimated to more and more intensification as far as what will get their attention, more and more gamification. What will they need in the fourth grade? When the fourth grade, they need more because the dopamine rush just won't be the same, right? So you keep on accelerating and augmenting that. What happens when those kids become, voting age? And what we're getting is very disposable attention spans, I think, is how I would refer to it. And I think that's what scares me the most is how do we tackle the huge issues we have, not just in the country, but in the world, when we have a citizenry in 20 years who have attention spans of 19, 20 seconds, which is what the research shows most recently. They can, college students in I think it was a 2023 study, that have attention spans of about 20 seconds. People our age are about 2.5 minutes. But we grew up analog, right? What happens when today's second grader is in college? What will the attention span be then? And when they're running the country? So I think that's what scares me even more globally than what's going on in the classrooms.
And I think something that also is scary is talking about the different time frames, 10 years, 15 years. So now we have teachers and administrators who, since this is so normal, they don't see any dangers. They have to be pointed out. But once they're pointed out, it's very clear, that you walk into a classroom and all the laptops are up. We know the teacher can't see. Sure, there's a monitoring program, but it's just not the same. And so much has been normalized. And it's very difficult. We'll do a staff development, we'll do a training for administrators, and we have to tell them, shut your laptops. Get off your phone. And that's what we're talking about is that issue with kids. So it is bigger than schools, like you say. It's adults really have to follow that lead. And first of all, acknowledge that they're there as well and that it's not okay. We want things to be okay. It's not okay. But we're also competing with technology companies that are, funded by billionaires, and it's just the promises that they make. They're too seductive.
Tim Wu talks about this in Attention Merchants, how things that have become normalized that were not, like having a phone at the dinner table. That just was not the norm before, right? Or, back in the maybe early 2010s, if the phone rang at church, the priest might make a joke about it. Oh, God's calling, Now it's like something you expect the phones to ring in church. And it shouldn't be, but it's become like just normalized, like Gene was talking about. So I think in chapter 4, we talk about creating a filter in classrooms for friction, just to slow down and to be more thoughtful about what we bring into classrooms. When you're thinking about a textbook adoption, it takes about 1.5 years, right? To adopt a textbook, you have to put it out to all the different stakeholders. You have public viewings of it, do a seance over it, and to finally adopt a curriculum. Or I can just go online and download an app and have it in front of kids, in a heartbeat. And there's ways to work around district filters and such. So we talk about that in chapter 4 of the book. We also talk about how this happened in classrooms and schools within a broader digital immersion. It didn't happen in isolation. So I think part of what happened is because we were all learning how to shop and be entertained and book our travel and use Google Maps and such, we didn't notice the same thing was going on in schools. And that's partly why it snuck up on us, I think. And it wasn't, I think maybe it was Johan Hari who talks about it in Still in Focus, that what COVID did, it's almost like that frog that's boiling in the water, and it's turning up really slowly. And it doesn't realize what's happening to it. What COVID did was it turned the heat up really fast. So that all of a sudden, those of us that were able to step out of it afterwards realized, hey, something's happened here that isn't good. And I think that's what's led us on this path. We started talking about this 3 years ago. And I'm glad to see that there's more, I think, voices out there now saying the same thing.
I also hear from teachers who report declines in working memory, sustained attention, and task persistence. What does the research say about what's happening cognitively?
Well, in digital illusions, there's a lot of data that just shows declining cognitively. I mean, he's pretty bold in how he says that. He doesn't talk about a learning loss, but he just, he's got data that show where this is the first generation that is not doing as well as the prior generation, or at least as well. So there's evidence out there, and it's pretty indisputable.
And I think he talked about that this generation is the first one that is like the IQ is actually lower than the parents' generation by about 6 points in the last 120 years. More recently, just on Monday, I think he came out with that article that showed where the NAEP scores have dropped over time. But I think, so that's cognitively, but I think what we're seeing is even at the subcognitive level, even things like holding information in working memory and being able to carry it from that center to that center, that has dropped off, or things like being able to lock in to what's on the board and then bringing that information down and copying it and writing down here and then looking back up again, that has dropped. Handwriting, because of we run school programs, we have, students do things. And so we have instant reports that kiddos write. And we actually have really good data going back and comparing handwriting from 2014 with handwriting from 2024. It is dramatically different. Handwriting of a second grader in 2014 is about equivalent with handwriting from a fourth grader now. So that's fine motor skills that are being lost as well. So there's those things you can see, that you can measure, and then there's things that unless you're looking for them, you don't necessarily see it. And so we talk about a little bit of this in chapter 6. We talk about how it's not enough to just focus on schools. Kiddos are in schools about 12% of the calendar. The calendar year is 8,700 hours, and the kids spend about 11 or 1,200 of it in school. So what happens to the other 6,000 hours, or 7,000 hours? So part of that is working at the superintendent and principal level, at school leader level, board level, working with everything from prenatal education providers to, colleges, and really taking a community effort, because what's happening in schools is only 12% of the year. It's what's happening outside of it, right? So in our after school programs and our summer programs, we've actually really done away, unless the kids are doing Lego robotics, because we do want them engineering and thinking in that way, unless they're doing that, or they have homework on their Chromebooks, they're basically not on screens at all. They're interacting with each other. We put in place a couple of things that we talk about in the book. One's called pencil practice, where they're actually learning how to transfer information, how to shift and lock their focus. We put in place like learning centers for them to have to memorize. The directions over there are such, and then I'm going to do that for 5 minutes and then go over there and have a different set of directions, because they're not getting a chance to practice that when they're just going from one app to the next on their screens. And so there's a cognitive decline, measured by test scores and such. But then below that, there's a subcognitive skills that we're really worried about. And we can think about it ourselves, memorizing phone numbers. We used to know 30, 40, 50 phone numbers. Now we know like maybe 3. And Nicholas Carr talked about this in The Shallows, very early book, 2010, talked about William James, an American psychologist, who compared learning to, water cutting through the sand, and how water cuts through a sand and it creates a channel. So the next time water comes the same way, it'll probably find that channel, right? Same thing's going on with neural pathways. It's making those channels deeper and deeper and deeper. And so once you practice certain things, like not memorizing phone numbers, guess what your brain's going to do? Not memorize that phone number, especially if it knows it doesn't need to. And that's not as necessary. But things like having a awareness about the environment, like one of the things that we noticed very early on with our staff applicants, again, our 20, 21, 22-year-olds, is we would ask them, where do you live? like the address, the cross streets. And the reason we needed to know that is so we knew like what schools to place them at, because we had like 35 schools. They didn't know cross streets. I live over by the Circle K. Like, what do you mean the Circle K? By the Circle K behind the nail salon. Like, we have a lot of nail salons, like you need to know, how do you find yourself in a three-dimensional space if you don't have that sense of space, of geography? So I think what we're losing goes well beyond cognitive into like some subcognitive things that make us be able to function.
And I think without an awareness of what Frank's talking about, we look for technology to help us get out of that. So, and I think, again, that's where these vendors are so good. Oh, you have a problem, your kids aren't performing well in this. We got an app. We got a platform. And so, again, the irony is really shows the captivity. Like we've got a problem caused by this, but the same people are going to help pull us out, which doesn't happen.
Can you explain screen inferiority in reading comprehension?
Yeah, so Johan Hari talks about that in Stolen Focus. And there's quite a few studies by now that have shown it, that because when we read, we are tracking left to right? And if we're reading a book, things don't pop out at you. You're not expecting things to pop out at you. There's a tactile connection. There's a connection to the brain that is different than when we read on screens. When we read on screens, we're skimming and scanning more. We're expecting more things to be going on with the text around it. And so what his book shows is that by the time the kids are in third grade, there's about a 2/3 of a year loss if they're reading primarily on screens versus reading primarily on text. And then that carries, that carries. We see that there's actually an article in, I'm sorry, not an article, a quote in the book from a teacher who, she taught for 37 years, a reading specialist and a college professor. And she, in a college class, she would give the students, first day of class, a 4th to 6th grade text just to see where they were. And she said that over the course of the last 10 years, there's been a steady decline in their ability to read, college students' ability to read 4th to 6th grade text, because they're very good at skimming and scanning. They're not as good as that linear reading and that internalizing of information. So, it's numbers, it's numerical. Johan Hari talks about that, but we see it every day, and we see it with, like Kathy did in the book.
And I think also some of the interventions for students, older students who aren't reading well, are based on, having this book in front of them, learning how to annotate, learning how to ask questions, learning how to read for prosody. All of these things, can't do it with a screen. You just can't. A big push now is to get novels back into secondary class or in all classrooms. And again, that has to be, you got to be holding that paper and that paper book to be able to do it. So I think there are just some things that screens you can't do. We just have to fess up to that.
There's Barbara Kingsolver's book, The Bean Trees, came out like in 88 or so, 89. And it's been passed on in my family. Everybody's read it because I have to read it in school because she's from Tucson and I went to UA. And then my son had to read it. My daughter had to read it. Now my youngest is reading it. And I came into a room last week and she was listening to something being read. And then I looked at her. She's got the book in her hand. It's The Bean Trees. And I said, what are you doing there? And she said, I'm reading a book. And I said, no, you're not reading. YouTube is reading. And she said, well, I'm following along. And she's like, but look, I've annotated it. So she understood that really she had to have some sort of tactile connection to it. But I told her, you need to actually be doing the effort of having your brain make that decoding and then turning that into comprehension. Because otherwise, it's not the same level of comprehension. So even kids who are pretty bright and doing the work, even the tactile work of it, will fall into those traps of what's the easiest way to do it. Like Gene was saying, the digital companies will say, here, we'll help you do it. So like in our programs after school, we've told them, we don't want you reading on the screen anymore. Take the kids outside, sit under a tree and read a book for the same reason. They need to hear the modeling, and they need to make that connection in a way that we walk into kindergarten classrooms sometimes, and kids don't know how to turn a page because they're so used to just swiping, on the iPad. So there's something being lost there for sure.
Why are lower achieving students seeing the steepest declines?
It gets back to instruction. I mean, it's hard not to leave instruction as the most important variable, which I think research, again, for the past 50, 60 years, that's one of the primary variables. And to be honest, it's how to teach is not taught in programs and teacher prep programs. In fact, again, during COVID, we don't want to blame COVID for everything, but they can be blamed for a few things. I mean, there were teachers who got their credential never having set foot in a classroom. And so the programs, they don't train teachers, but they educate teachers about things. And so they don't learn how to teach a lesson, but they read about different ways to teach lessons. And so I think there's just a dearth of education in pre-service.
I think also that, to your question about why the kids who were struggling the most are struggling more, we dedicate the book to kids who need to be taught. There are some children who can go to the library on their own and they're fine. And we see it now when we walk into classrooms. Like yesterday, I was telling the administrators I was with, like, you can tell that the screens have made the self-directed kids continue to be active learners. And those who want to opt out can opt out. It's much harder to do that when there's that interaction with the teacher. Teachers modeling, doing guided practice, and making the kids accountable moment to moment. I think that's fallen off, and I think because that accountability has fallen off, that relationship has fallen off between the teacher and the students. I think that's been a big piece of it. But going back, even like Gene was talking about, the 1970s and 80s, Ruby Payne, Framework for Understanding Poverty, if you remember that book from, I think it was the late 80s, talked about how the single most important thing we do as far as instruction is the modeling piece, because the modeling is where you demystify the learning. It makes it quit being magic, and it becomes, oh, I can do that too. And that, with the modeling falling off, that demystification has fallen off. And I think you see a lot more kids having this learned helplessness because they're not getting that anymore. So I think that's why you're seeing the steep declines. And again, the numbers show it. We talk about this in chapter 1, the Britt Van Winkle piece, that instead of coming from the past, he had come from the future. He had come from 2034 and told educators in 2014, hey guys, I've been to the future. And you spent about $40 billion a year to get more and more digital into classrooms. And what you're going to see is that the high achieving kids, they'll do about the same. But your low achieving kids, they're going to tank. Like, who would buy that? Nobody would buy that if we knew it in 2014, 2015. We're realizing it now in 2025, 2026. But I think that it's going to continue. Earlier, when you asked the question about what scares you the most, I think it's this bifurcation that's happening. There was an article in the New York Times regarding reading habits. People who are reading still are reading more. But the number of people who didn't read a single book in the U.S. in 2024, I think it was over 50%. So those of us that read more because there's more to read. Those of us that don't read have chosen not to. So there's this big bifurcation happening that's going to open up that inequality gap even more, I think.
So thinking about the future then, if this trend continues, what are long-term implications?
There's a good quote from a superintendent at the end of chapter 1 where we talk about there's alternative paths to this path that we're on. And this particular superintendent, really well regarded, she was she got the Technology Administrator Award of the Year in California a few years back. So she's very pro-tech. But she said, if this trend continues, we're going to go obsolete. And we're really worried about, when we first started having these conversations 2.5 years ago, it was really regarding the place of the mainstream school and mainstream public school and where that's going. And I think, coming out of COVID in particular, we're looking at virtual schools, homeschooling, alpha schools. There's all these schools that are becoming alternatives to schools, right? we feel like there's a really important place in America for the mainstream neighborhood public school. And that's what I see as being a big concern, is that the more we hollow that out, the more that it becomes like, well, if you're going to go to school and watch a screen, my kid can do that at home. Why send him to school? You know, we continue hollowing that out till at some point we hit a tipping point that we can't get back from. Because, you know, every year, if attendance drops, if enrollment drops, your funding drops. It gets harder to fund. Therefore, it's like you're running up a hill backwards. And so I think that that's what is a really big cause for concern down this path that we're on right now.
And it's interesting how schools are in competition. Our mainstream public schools are in competition with charters. And so they are running, how can we provide what the charter's providing? And what's a charter usually providing? More tech. And so they get onto this treadmill and they don't know how to get off. And as an administrator, it's hard to back away and say, well, wait a second, maybe we're not doing the right thing. Maybe all these things that I was cheerleading for weren't quite the best thing to do for kids. So everybody has some readjustment. Administrators, parents, as Frank talked about, thinking about what happens at home, how we interact with our children. I think we just have to, eat a big piece of humble pie and say we made a mistake.
Yes. You share that learning is fundamentally social. So how has device-heavy instruction changed the social experience of school?
It's just taking it away. I mean, you walk into a classroom and everybody's got headphones on and looking at a screen. Where's the interaction? And so then I'm going to go off on a tangent here. We're going to go off, on AI, to where now we get interaction with AI. AI can be our friends, which has been very scary for folks. So we lose skills. We don't know how to make friends. We don't know how to interact appropriately. All of those things contribute to the answer being more tech. We'll give them some interaction with the tech.
Yeah, we'll give them an AI friend. There's a couple of examples that are in the book and a couple that didn't make it that were great interview quotes from teachers. The teacher, I think a Spanish teacher maybe. The kids are on their screens and she's 6 feet away and they will send her a message on the device instead of just raising a hand and asking the question. She'll say, Tim, I'm right here. You can ask me the question. Oh, never mind. And they're not comfortable having that interaction like with the adults. But, like Gene said, you walk into the classroom and you can almost measure without even looking, are they on screens or not, because how quiet it is. A lot less interaction. And Jonathan Haidt talked about this in Anxious Generation. He's a professor at NYU, right? How those last 5 minutes before class started would be the most bubbly time in his lectures. Everybody's talking to the person next to them about what they did on the weekend or whatever test is coming up. And now it's the quietest time. The quietest time because everybody's on their phones. And the same thing I think happens in schools that allow phones. What used to be the most bubbly time, the most interactive time, the periods right before class started or maybe in the passing period, had become very quiet. Everybody's walking with their head down. So the social interaction piece that's being lost is being lost in the classroom during guided practice, during closure, during checking for understanding, because it's being done by the bot, and it's being lost outside of the classroom as well.
Are there any other things that teachers are telling you about student communication, resilience, regulation?
Yeah, I never had heard the term dysregulation before until about 2 years ago, about the ability to kind of center themselves and find how to behave. So definitely we've heard that. I think we see it in our programs as well, that all the pieces you asked about are happening.
Well, and I think something else that we've been doing for quite a long time that the technology has exasperated, we have to have a program for everything. The kids don't communicate. They don't, SEL. Let's have a new program. And kids don't have self-esteem. Well, we need a new program. And so we have all of these programs that are supposed to mitigate, again, the issues that are being exasperated by the technology. But we don't go to technology. We don't remove technology as an answer. We bring more technology in. And it's just, again, we're captive. Our thinking doesn't move beyond that.
There's a good chapter in the book that our third author, who's not here today because she's actually in a school, which is, again, what I think makes us different. We're actually in schools every week. But she wrote a chapter on durable skills and integrating those into the lesson design and into really making that be not an add-on program, but like you teach a lesson and you integrate these skills, right? You integrate communication, collaboration, critical thinking. It's not an aside and it's not a program. It's something you just do as part of your lesson design. Probably my favorite part of the book is the superintendent's speech at the end of it. And the superintendent kind of is compared to a superintendent in the prologue of the book who was the gung-ho in 2014. The setting is 2014 for the prologue. Very gung-ho, very like, let's get this. We got to get a screen in front of every kid. The superintendent in 2034, which is where the epilogue is, says we're not going to do that. We're going to dial back. We're going to use them when we need them, but they're not going to dominate our lives. We don't like what we're seeing with our kids. And he talks about durable skills and communication and collaboration and all of that. And the fictional superintendent says, not that long ago, computer science majors were like the exploding major, right, at colleges across the country. Some of those kids can't find a job now because AI is taking that away, right? We need to make the kids durable themselves. And it's not so much the content, it's not so much the program, it's having those skills where they get to adapt and interact and communicate and collaborate that is missing. And it's not bringing in, let's add on an SEL program or whatever. It's let's integrate it into what the kids are doing every day. Very difficult to do if they're on screens 3 or 4 hours a day.
So if you were advising a superintendent tomorrow, what's the first move toward balance?
Buy digital captives. I say it as a joke, but as Frank said, this is what's different about this book is that the three of us who were involved in this book were actually working in schools in the aughts. I never said that before. In the aughts, we were working and seeing this work, seeing what we talked about, actually doing this work. That. I mean, Frank used to be in your district doing that work. So we know that it's not enough to identify the problem. What can we do about it? It's going to be as difficult to get out of the problem as it was easy to get in, but there is a roadmap. And I think that's the power of this book. There are so many folks in the consulting business who like to go in and walk around and say, oh, you need to do this, you need to do that. But how do you do it? And I think that's a big difference in this book.
Yeah, I think we spend basically the intro and chapter 1 presenting the problem, and then 2 through 6 how to get out of that, And so yeah, read the book would be the first thing. But I think secondly would be like, let's go to your classrooms. Let's go walk 20 classrooms randomly, and let's just look at how engaged are the students with only one variable. Are they on screens or not? And what you're going to see is the more they're on screens, the less engaged they are. And I don't need a double-blind experiment for that. We can just go and walk into 20 classrooms, or probably any school in the country, any mainstream public school in the country that purports to be balanced, and we would see it.
So what does healthy intentional tech integration actually look like then?
It's a good question. We were just having a conversation yesterday, actually, with regarding how to use AI to help us write lessons that integrate collaboration, communication, and everything else. It's not saying, I'll start by saying what it's not. It's not like taking the Chromebooks away. It's not that. The kiddos are going to need them. They're going to need to be able to, every day we use it. We use email, we do video conferences, we're using technology right now, right? We're going to put this out on social media. So we know that we need to use the devices. What healthy is, it's not the default. The default is the human interaction. So I'd be looking at a classroom at the elementary level, let's say. The kids are not on it more than 10% of the time in the primary grades. There's actually, in the superintendent's speech in chapter 6, he gives this theoretical, like graduated digital model where in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, kids aren't dominant like 10, 20% of the time. By the time you get to high school, maybe 40% of the time. But it's always less than the contact they're having humanly. They can get the screens at home. They shouldn't, but they can. What they can't get at home is the interaction with 29 classmates, right? They can't get that. So that's a part that I think would be a key piece in the balance.
And many times as administrators, we're afraid to make these changes. What's going to happen if we do it? When we have convinced a teacher to try a lesson without screens, it's almost like a sigh of relief. The kids are so happy not to be on the Chromebook all period or a big part of the period. They miss it. And that's that transformational things that we're talking about. And we learn from other people, and we need to have that contact. We're stealing that. We just have to have some courage to try things.
I was in a math classroom, an alternative education site. Kids are used to just being on the screens, right? That's the nature of an alternative ed site a lot of the times. And we convinced the teacher to try a math lesson. Just 6 kids in the class. And she taught the lesson. She had a hook that connected to real life learning. She had an objective. She taught the big idea. I think that was like computing simple interest, something like that. Yeah, that's what it was. And the hook was like, if you have money in the bank, would you have 2% interest or 4% interest? And then she modeled, and the kids did guided practice using the whiteboards from 2005 or prior to. And at the end of the lesson, we're going to sit down and debrief the lesson. And the student had walked out and walked back in. And she said, "Miss, can we do that again tomorrow?" Yeah. The teacher said, "Did you enjoy that?" And she's like, "Yeah, I like learning." So I think that there's that's a huge aha. But we got to convince the teacher to go back and do it again tomorrow, because it's so easy to not, right? So yeah, that was like a really telling moment for me, both for what Gene was saying and for how hard it is to break those habits that have become ingrained the last 3, 4, 5 years, 10 years.
What questions should leaders be asking before adopting new tech, especially AI?
Well, there's a whole chapter on it, and it's called using the educational vision or instructional vision as a filter. And that should be question number 1, is what's our purpose here as in whatever school district? There's a fictional school district called Irving School District in the beginning. What is our purpose in the Irving School District? What is our mission, our vision? That should be the first filter. Does it fit the vision or not? If in our vision we say we want kids who can collaborate, kids who can communicate well, who can sustain focus, who can read deeply, is this program doing that? Let's say that it is doing all those things. Then the next question is, okay, what's it replacing, right? So it's always an opportunity cost question, is you only have 6 hours in the day. How good must this program be to take some of those 6 hours, right? Because, that's the most valuable resource that schools have, is that time with the kiddos. And if you're going to take some of that time away and turn it over to a screen, boy, it better meet your vision. It better meet your instructional program. And it better be doing a better job of it. One last quote. I don't know if Gene wants to jump in on this one as well, but from the same Spanish teacher, actually, she was talking about when you're in a Spanish class or any language class, you practice, right? Well, now you can practice with a bot instead of practicing with a person. And what the teacher was talking about is just how much more formulaic the practice is now. In the past, you would, make eye-to-eye contact, you practice whatever the phrase is you're learning, you giggle, you embarrass yourself a little bit, but you learn from it, right? You learn to deal with embarrassment, you learn how to put yourself out there a little bit. But when you're getting that feedback from a screen, it's only really assessing where you corrected. So I think back to your question of what should a superintendent ask themselves, I think it's that. It's like, what is being lost? Besides the time, does it fit into our vision? It's like, what are we losing by turning to this program instead of having that human interaction?
And I think the whole vision thing, there's probably people rolling their eyes. Oh, we're going to have another vision. But this is really an important criteria to make those decisions, because it's not like you're a new text adoption that you have a year to do it and you have all this time, because these people are coming out with these apps, one after another. So you have to have some sort of grounding to make these decisions, and you have to make them fairly quickly, because you have teachers they found this one, they found that one, and then the one that they gave up, that platform, guess what? They just have a super improved version. And so if you aren't grounded in what we are all about, instructionally, you're going to just flounder every time we have one of those issues. And when the decisions aren't made and they aren't clear to the teachers, they just say, oh, this is capricious. They're anti-tech. No, we have to have that vision. Does this match the vision? And it has to be expressed how this decision was made.
Yeah, Dr. Smith was in a elementary school recently, Donna, just in a morning walk in 2 hours at an elementary school. She and the administrator that she was walking with came across 12 student-facing apps that hadn't made their way through any sort of district filtering system. These are apps that are, again, student-facing or are taking student time, but in some cases, they even require like student personal information being entered into them. And the administrators were shocked. But I think one truth that we've learned is, going back to your fictional superintendent, you asked, like, what would you advise a superintendent on? Is maybe the very first thing would be, I want you to estimate how many minutes we're going to see students are on the screens. And almost always, it's an underestimate. Yeah. And I think if you follow, like at the secondary level, kids go from period to period, follow a cohort of kids the whole day. Then you'll get a real understanding about, oh man, it's true. They're getting this in period 1, this in period 2, this in period 3. And some of the programs are good, but they should be supplementary. They should not be replacing, right? They should be augmenting. They should not be taking the place out. And in many places, it's actually become the instruction.
Or a substitute for instruction, more accurately, I think.
Makes sense. If we get this right, what could schools look like 5 years from now?
Well, that's what started this whole thing was I was asking people, in positions like yourself, what does this look like in 2032? And in some of the responses that I got, that we got were like, 2032, I want to make it to next week, because it was tough coming out of the pandemic, right? With the kiddos running for the hills like we were talking about, and the mental health concerns, and teachers worried about coming back as well. So it was really tough in that setting, 2022, 23, 24. So we're asking that. But I think, chapter 6 and then the epilogue really talk about what they should look like if we get it right. What it should look like is standards-based, intentional, personal instruction in the classroom with durable skills being built, technology being used in an augmenting manner. But outside of that, there's connections going on with, local parks and rec. In Nicholas Carr's book, Super Bloom, he talks about the decline in youth, sports league activities, scouting, church activities, something like 800 hours a year for the average teenager in the last 10 years decline in terms of interacting with others. So it would be not just what's going on in the school. In our vision, in our hope, the school becomes a catalyst for a community-wide effort. And it might be asking a lot, especially like in really large districts and really big urban areas. But definitely, you can be a hub. You can be a hub where, like, restaurant nights in this community, Thursday is no screen.
Something else that I think is going to be happening in the public schools is, especially when we're asking schools to have an instructional vision, there will be a lot of schools of choice. Because that's one of the things that we have found out, or that we're competing against, is all of these charter schools that pop up with an emphasis with something. And I think that's good that we have choice, but we have to be sure that we're protecting the kids the way that Frank just talked about. Unless we've got these alpha school now, unless you just choose that for your kids. But we need to, be really clear about who we are. And who we are is, the way Frank described it right now, is not a bad place to be in the marketplace. I think a lot of people would choose that. But like many charters, or, they start out in a certain way and then they devolve. So I think we have to be very careful about maintaining that instructional vision, so that people have an expectation of, you come to here in this school district, this is what you're going to get. And, and it's okay. If you want your kids to be on screens 8 hours a day, then this place isn't for you. But I think, because of how effective we know we can be with the technology to augment quality instruction, I think we can create some good product.
I think the book is really augmented by teacher interviews that we did. Probably did like 36 teacher interviews, K through college, across the country, small districts, huge districts, suburban districts, urban districts, rural districts. One of the things we noticed is that a lot of teachers talked about parents starting to push back on the amount of screen time. And in some districts where the teachers we interviewed for one particular subset of questions, we needed them to have been in the classroom teaching the same grade or close in a similar socioeconomic level, 2014, 2024. Because we were asking questions like comparing, student behaviors and such. And what we heard from them is that the same parents who in 2014 for their older kids were advocating, more and more and more, you got to catch up, we got to catch up. By 2024, we're saying for their younger kids, let's get them off. Too much screen time. The same parents. And so I think that there's a groundswell, and it isn't just the books, it isn't just Digital Delusions, it isn't just ours, it isn't just the articles in Education Next and in New York Times. I think that parents are seeing it. We were doing some research just for promotional purposes. We found a Facebook group that's like Reduce My Kids' Screen Time, something like that. 280,000 members, parent members in the U.S. I mean, that's a pretty big group. There's a groundswell for it. So I think that, like Gene said, if you want your child to have that, you're going to definitely have the option if you want it to be on a screen for 6-8 hours a day. Parents didn't choose this. They didn't choose what we're seeing right now. And that's what we need to walk back, is that if they want that choice, they can have it. But this isn't what we should be doing in the mainstream public schools.
And I think a big takeaway is nobody made this choice. It just happened. It just happened.
I've really appreciated this conversation. In closing, I'd like to ask you, what gives you hope?
There is a reaction. Unfortunately, it's another pendulum swing from all of these screens to no screen time. That's not sustainable. That's not reality. That is not where we're going. So I think the fact that there are 280,000, I think that there are people, stepping forward, that gives me hope. What diminishes that hopefulness a little bit is that it's always an overreaction. We can see that in many of the things that are going on, like in schools of choice right now, where in states where they could take their kids someplace else. The question is, what happens to the students that have special needs? They don't worry about them, but that's something that, again, this is going back to institutional memory. This isn't new. We have these things in place because of who we were before, and we needed to get better. So what gives me hope? More people thinking about, there's a better way to do education.
I think Gene might be more hopeful than me, but talking about the institutional memory, that if you go back at least as far back as Madeline Hunter in the 60s and 70s, the Effective Schools movement, Ronald Edmonds, Marzano in the 90s and 2000s, and now his Evaluation Center, the 90-90-90 schools, the New Teacher Project, Teach for America, which is how I started teaching, how I got into teaching. We know that there's an alternative path that is actually a very good path, and we know what we should be doing in schools. The question that Ronald Edmonds, the Effective Schools movement, asks is, how do we feel about the fact that we haven't done it yet? So that's the hope. But the hope is that we know what we got to do. My concern is, and this is part of our parent education series, because we also do parent education, which is actually another piece of it that I think is something we do that nobody else does, that we're also working with the parents, is that I'm not going to name any companies. I don't want to get, we don't want to get sued. But, in the prologue of the book where the superintendent is really pitching, we're going to go after this money and we need to get a screen in front of every kid. He talks about getting a particular type of laptop into every child's hand because the digital companies are being great social citizens. They're helping the kids get access to the screens. They're helping write the Common Core assessments, smarter balance in the park. And then later on, we found out that some of those same companies were data mining those kids as young as 4 years old. So what gives me pause is that there's a villain on the other side. It wasn't a conscious choice by schools to go down this path. It was this broader digital immersion. But there was a conscious choice. So folks who are data mining 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, who were giving free email access, let's say, but then data mining what the kids were writing so that they can market to them a few years later, there definitely is a villain in this. And that's what gives me pause. But hopefully this groundswell, the Senate hearings that we're seeing now, there's going to be enough of not a revolt, but a pushback. And I do hope that, to Gene's point, that we just don't go so far the other way that then we then lose, it just becomes that pendulum again.
I think just of who we are in the United States, you can't tell me what to do. And then you have, I don't know how many school districts. You worked in a small school district for a while, and they had a school board, and they didn't want anybody telling them what to do. And so it's difficult. Who we are is our strength, and who we are is makes anything changing education difficult.
Yes. Well, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bart.
If you're enjoying these podcasts, tell a friend. Also, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can follow me on Blue Sky at G Tavernetti, on Twitter, X, at G Tavernetti, and you can learn more about me and the work I do at my website, tesscg.com. That's TESSCG.com, where you will also find information about ordering my books, Teach Fast, Focused Adaptable Structured Teaching, and maximizing the impact of coaching cycles.